taking part and giving evidence to us today. We really would like to hear from your experiences in other jurisdictions about how the forensic science service or provision to judiciary is organized in other countries.
It's a great pleasure and great honor to be invited. I hope the connection won't be too bad.
Thank you. So if I might make a start, what is it that United Kingdom can learn in terms of forensic science provision in the criminal justice system from other jurisdictions that you have had experience of in terms of Australia and Switzerland? And I know you also represent internationally the organization. So please tell us what is your experience and how UK differs.
Yes, so it's a very interesting and difficult question. I think the first thing I would like to say here, I think we have to be careful about the definition of forensic science provision and what we mean by forensic science provision. There may be a tendency sometimes in some jurisdictions, and I'm not too sure in your country, but it may be the case sometimes, where forensic science provision is seen as a laboratory which is essentially providing an analytical service, very simply said, almost like a pill testing facility, and where forensic scientists are mainly wearing lab coats and in laboratory. The reality is, really forensic science starts at the scene. And if we're talking about criminal investigation, we talk about crime scene. And, it's very hard to make sense and answer questions if we don't consider crime scene investigation, because it's the start of everything. And it's where a lot of scientific processes and thought processes and logic occur. So in all my answers, really, I'll make a big point on that. So we can't really talk about forensic science provision without looking at the whole end-to-end process from the scene to the court. Now, having said that, different models are possible and how we can really do that. But really, my experience is there is the interface between the field and the lab, and more broadly with policing, are crucial. So it's impossible to keep police forces out of the equation. In my observations, features of successful models, could be summarized in a few points if you want. First, forensic science is provided in a non-commercial environment, so mainly government-based. The provision of services is accessible to the broader justice system, prosecution and defense. The service actually, it's providing genuine expertise and advice and not a simple analytical service. It's a main feature of very successful models. Another feature is the need for an adequate workforce in an adequate system. And by that, I mean strong relevant education, continued training and engagement in research and development. Another feature is scientific culture and quality management that are consistent across the board. And in my observation as well, there is a need for strong alignment of scientific and managerial leadership with appropriate representation at senior executive. So if we're talking about police, for example, it's really at the chief constable level for England and Wales. And because there is a need to make appropriate decisions and have the same backing powers as others in the organization. And obviously, successful models are supported by strong funding commitment that includes funding to ongoing relevant research that is best achieved by very strong links between forensic science provider and academia. Now, you asked the question about Australia and Switzerland. So if Australia really has two very good examples of successful holistic provision within police, with the Australian Federal Police and Victoria Police. And in addition to what I mentioned before, if I look at the AFP, so the Australian Federal Police, they've recently introduced a consultancy model between investigators and scientists, and as well among specialists within the various forensic disciplines. It's really a science-led enterprise, multidisciplinary, and really a problem-solving approach. So they are, very effective in the early hours of receipt of exhibits. The recovery starts really very quickly. There is a single point of contact, and there is dynamic access to a range of experts. The collection of exhibits and traces and analysis of items are directed at investigative problem solving, and they use the full potential of intelligence value of forensic science. And even the physical space of the laboratory is designed to maximize interactions between forensic disciplines. Another interesting and I would say successful model for Australia is the Victoria Police. The Forensic Science Department has 500 staff that is led by an executive director with a chief scientist office that is in charge of research and development and scientific leadership. One thing to note is in Australia, forensic science provision is accredited across the board, including within police and crime scene investigation. You mentioned Switzerland. So Switzerland has small services with strong ties with the University of Lausanne. So it's a main feature, a very strong tie with the academic world and in one specific university, including joint appointments. They are ensuring that the science is kept up to date and the research and development questions are relevant. Obviously, it has big benefits for education, continuing education, training, and there is a strong common forensic science culture across all the stakeholders. Forensic science is seen as a complete discipline, not only as a service using other disciplines, and it's providing value-added information from intelligence to the courts and investigations. One interesting feature in Switzerland is there is an effective use of the general forensic scientist model. People who are general forensic scientists, a bit like a general practitioner in medicine. And these people have fundamental knowledge of traces, understanding of criminal phenomena, and they usually attend the scene. So there is a combination of academics and scientists in forensic science services and in the field. A third country I would just mention in passing, because I've never experienced working there, but from my observation, where there is an interesting model as well, which appears to be successful, but it's using a segregated model between a main lab and police forces. It's the Netherlands, with the National Forensic Institute in the Netherlands. And I think the main feature here is, again, they are backed up by a very strong scientific leadership.
Thank you. That was very useful information. Can I now pass on to ask Lord Mayor?
Thank you, Chairman. You've talked about the police forensic science and other laboratories. Can you say something about the private sector and how does the forensic science market operate in your experience?
Yes, that's a very interesting question again. I would start with the general observation. When I was a student, England and Wales had essentially the international benchmark. It was the international benchmark. It was, inverted comma, the mecca for forensic science. Now, some 30 years later, my observation from the outside, and I make no judgment here, it's really a rational, objective observation. It seems to me that it's been an ongoing national crisis, And at that stage, it's more an example not to follow. Now, I understand the philosophical and ideological dimension, to the argument and the discussion here, and I will stay away from that. It's really not my role. But objectively, when we look at the outcomes of privatization of forensic science in England and Wales, from what I observe and what I read, really, it simply said it doesn't work. Forensic science provision, in my opinion, is not about selling test results. It's not about selling products. It's about providing the most relevant, informative, and transparent expert advice. When we talk about research and development, it's not about developing products or intellectual property, but it's really about advancing the science. And really, there is a need for cooperation and coordination between all the stakeholders, and especially providers, including police, academia, and courts. It's all that is very, very essential. And again, I can understand it's linked to a very strong commitment to appropriate funding for forensic science provision, training, and research.
Thank you. Could you just clarify, are there any private sector forensic science organisations in Australia, Switzerland, or the Netherlands?
Look, I mean, they are usually small organisations and quite often sole traders, and they are probably areas of forensic science provision which are more amenable to privatization, especially when we think about some document examination, some drug testing, even some DNA testing. Things where it's relatively easy to put a costing and to put a charge and some kind of binary, almost digital examination, if you want. When we talk about complex cases, when we talk about typical analysis of chemicals, chemical traces, and so on, in my experience, there are very, very few, if any, private laboratories.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Claude. I'm now going to move on to another question from Lord Oxborough.
Thank you very much. From your experience in different jurisdictions and in Australia, of course, do you see any major gaps in scientific understanding which could be addressed by suitably targeted research? Because, research done in abstract without a particular aim in mind can end up not being very useful. So can you see obvious areas that need more work and which could be done?
Yes, it's a very good question. I'm tempted to say that there are major gaps everywhere, but maybe let's start with the easy part. As I tried to explain before, forensic science is really an end-to-end process, a continuum from the crime scene to court. And the middle bit, which is the traditional forensic science laboratory, it may surprise you, but it's relatively well mastered. It's as some of very eminent colleagues, said, it's the easy bit. It's kind of trivial almost. And interestingly, when you look at research going on in forensic science, a lot of research is actually undertaken in that space. And there is a very simple reason for that, is that Academics need research funding, they need research grants, and actually it's an area which is closer to traditional science, if you want, or at least academic science, and it's easier to get funding for. But unfortunately, it's not where the gaps are. So there is a bit of a disconnect. One area that has been recently really improving and growing and emerging, especially from the efforts of my colleague at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, is that despite the community's awareness of the potential of traces, beyond supporting decisions in court, actually forensic science results are still generated and used on a case-by-case basis, and as well as in separate organizations. So there is a need, and there is quite interesting research going on, but there are still major gaps, trying to see how we can use forensic science more effectively, much earlier in investigation and for intelligence purposes as well. Linking the dots, which is what's difficult, not simply the analysis. There are gaps in fundamental principles. I mean by that fundamental principles of forensic science. That was already identified in the 60s by a number of authors, and I don't think we moved significantly there. It's linked to the need to highlight and understand and agree on philosophies and logic that are used in forensic science. I mentioned forensic intelligence, the link to policing, security. These are all very interesting topics where there are gaps. And then I'm sure an area which you are mostly interested, it's all the space around evaluation and communication, and especially the value of evidence in court. There are still major gaps here in our understanding how forensic traces are generated, how they persist, how common they are, what happens depending on different scenarios, then there are gaps in research linked to ethics or the effectiveness of forensic science. How effective is it if we apply forensic science in such cases? It's not simply an economic argument. I mean, there is a lot of sociological research linked to criminology that is really needed. And more recently, there is the impact of decentralization and digital transformation. Again, I think there are major gaps in our understanding and what it actually means to forensic science provision. So what I'm trying to say here is that research in forensic science must really go beyond the technical elements. Otherwise, it's very protracted and only feeds this middle bit, which is already relatively well mastered. So as I mentioned, we need to do research linked to criminology, to policing, to law, and more broadly, social sciences. Now, these questions, actually, the research questions usually come out of casework. And the translation of these questions into robust, valid research require collaboration with academia. So usually forensic science providers are not in a position to conduct this type of research and extent of research on their own. So it's essential for any provider to have very strong ties with academia. And there is also a need for appropriate relevant research culture at all levels, and a need to be strategic and probably have a national strategic plan for forensic science research, a plan that should be coordinated by an appropriate body. So, for example, in Australia, we've got the National Institute of Forensic Science, which has been in operation since the early 90s, and part of the cooperation and collaboration role of NIFS is to identify an R&D plan and innovation plan for the forensic science sector. I mean, again, my observation is that there was a genuine engagement with forensic science research in the UK when I was a student 30 years ago. I'm a bit concerned that you know, a lot of that has been lost despite the plethora of forensic science programs you have in your country. I think ultimately the research questions need to be articulated to decision makers, because it's the decision makers who will secure and allocate the funding.
Claude, Lord Mayor has a couple of supplementary.
Yes, in the your biography details, you referred to Australia being sort of world leading in research on fingerprinting, and I wanted to ask you, are there any remaining gaps? And also, I want to ask you, is the results of your research on fingerprinting being applied elsewhere in the world?
Yes. Yes, I mean, fingerprints are a very interesting topic because actually, historically, it's how forensic science research started in Australia through the Australian National University in the 1980s, in collaboration with the Australian Federal Police. So it was already, the model was already there in the early 80s. So in terms of the research, I mean, we've done a lot of research in fingerprint, especially finger mark detection, in collaboration with law enforcement, especially the Australian Federal Police, but other law enforcement agencies. And you know, we try to tackle difficult surfaces, for example, in Australia, and now you have as well in the UK, the polymer banknote. And one you know, difficulty with the polymer banknote is that it's a difficult surface to find to detect fingerprints on. Traditional methods don't work very well. So we you know, many years ago we did a fair bit of research in that space, and with the proliferation of the polymer banknote around the world, you know, our research outcomes have been implemented in a lot of different countries. And I mean, we've had you know, we have a very good relationship with CAST, who I understand changed name, or it's been you know, changed in the structure in the UK in the Home Office for many years.
Claude, I'm going to ask my colleagues to make their questions short and not give any background. And
Yep.
because we have key questions to go through, Lord Hunt has one short question for you.
Yes, my short question is, when you were reviewing the academic aspects of forensic science, you didn't talk about data. One of the who and where is the data stored? Are academics developing data banks, or is this done by the government? Because that has obviously changes when you change the organisation.
Yeah, but it's a good question. I mean, it's difficult to reach one answer without having a bit of background and understand the context here. Look, I mean, the data. Okay, from an academic viewpoint, now there is a very strong move towards the need to share the data publicly as much as possible, because research is publicly funded. So there is an expectation that we should share the data with interested parties. And there are you know, a lot of different guidelines from an academic perspective. You know, who has stewardship of the data, talking about privacy and so on. So I mean, that's one aspect. I guess if we deal in research with data that is owned by the forensic science provider in the first place. So for example, we've done a fair bit of research in the area of drug intelligence, trying to improve and streamline you know, the value of forensic drug data. if you want, that is collected by the Forensic Science Lab and through the federal police. The data is owned by the AFP. So in that situation, we are, given the data, and quite often it's probably in most cases some kind of a sanitized version of the data. So to ensure that all the legislations are well covered in terms of privacy, confidentiality, all that. And we use the data for the research purposes, but ultimately the data, is really owned by the forensic science provider, which is the AFP in that case. So I don't think there is a simple answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claude. I'm now going to move on to ask Baroness Manningham-Buller the next question.
Thank you for your answers, which have been very full and interesting. You've touched on what I'm interested in your earlier answers. You've emphasised the importance of science and it being good science. But what is the minimum structure you need to make the connections between the academics and the community who want this information? And you added the intelligence community to the police and others. So what is the minimum you would suggest we need to make sure that information flows properly?
Look, this is again a very, very interesting question. I would start by saying, the ideal structures, it's not common. There are rather limited number of examples. I mentioned Switzerland and Australia, and more recently there is Canada in Quebec, and to some extent, not to some extent, probably really truly, there has been some development in Scotland. I think there is a need to have a transdisciplinary structure. I think there is a need for an academic unit, whether we talk about center, department, or whatever, but there is a need to understand that there is a discipline called forensic science, and it's not simply a glamorized chemistry or biology department, and it's not simply a glamorized Don't get me wrong, they are very useful people and who do fantastic science and are extremely useful to forensic science. But in my view, this is not enough if we really want to tackle some of the main challenges we see now occurring in forensic science. So there is a need for a transdisciplinary structure with a good number of academics with good vision. These academics must be dedicated and well supported, including by the university, and they must be working in conjunction with forensic science providers. So there is no point to do academic research in forensic science with no ties and no strong ties with the forensic science providers. In the successful models I mentioned before, often there is an integration or at least some kind of involvement of these academics in the governance of forensic science. So there is some kind of a body, national body, where there is some kind of a committee and where some key academic players really are invited to essentially contribute to shape the forensic science landscape in that country. Often there are some joint appointments. So we see, and it's especially the case with my colleague in Switzerland, in Lausanne, where there are people who have a shared appointment between the forensic science service and the university, which is absolutely ideal to bring the science up to speed in the sector, in the practicing sector, and in the same time bring back very relevant research questions and training issues to the academic academic institution. Now, in some kind of an ideal vision, and I must admit, I haven't seen it completely achieved yet. Although I think the University of Lausanne is probably probably the closest to it. It would be really leaning towards a teaching hospital model. So, say in medicine, you've got universities linked with a teaching hospital. there are complex cases going to emergency. There is a transdisciplinary consultancy model here. There is training, there is research, there are real cases, all concentrated in pretty much one site or in one organization. So that has been a model that has been worked in medicine for many years. It's a model that has been sometimes mentioned in forensic science. Unfortunately, as I said, I haven't seen it completely achieved yet. I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but
yes,
really,
yes.
Maybe one option would be really to, sorry.
You certainly have. Thank you very much.
The Baroness Morgan has a supplementary question to that.
Just a small question.
Thank you.
Can you help me understand what a successful faculty, department, institute of forensic science, what the skill set is? I mean, because I think we collectively have struggled as we've gone through an inquiry about precisely where the boundaries are on forensic science. And it's clearly a bit of a porous boundary, I think. But what for you are the absolutely core elements, and to what extent are you a clearinghouse or a network bringing in other skills?
Yes, look. I think there is again, it's an interesting question, because really I think I'm not sure if we can talk about a paradigm shift that is needed, but first there is a need to reconsider the definition of forensic science. And I think, that by reconsidering forensic science, not so much as a service only or mainly to the courts, using other sciences as an application. I think, if we look at forensic science as the science and the science of traces, these remnants of activity and presence of people and people who have an understanding of these major forensic science concepts, what it means across the board. I give you an example. Quite often when there is a new field coming up, a new technique or a new field. So we've seen that when analytical chemistry grew significantly. All of a sudden, a lot of people started to be interested in forensic science. And they started to almost reinvent the wheel, thinking about, what's the value of the chemical analysis? How do we express that finding? All the questions around quality assurance around the chemical trace, and so on. Then we've seen the same, now we're seeing the same thing happening, with the new digital space. So we see, a whole sector of technologists mainly interested in the technology of the digital space, and there is nothing wrong with it. It's just a question of, I guess, of perspective. But without considering these questions within the fundamental forensic science framework, and look at the digital trace as the trace and recognizing that as it is, we tend to reinvent the wheel, and we miss opportunities to exploit that new trace effectively. So there is a sense of almost reinventing the wheel all the time when something new comes up, because we haven't managed to get the major fundamental principles well accepted in a consensual way, pretty much universally. And I think that's probably the first thing to do when we talk about what kind of skill set we need. We need to really try to identify what we mean by forensic science, what we need in forensic science, and then we can talk about the specialties if you want.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claude. Very helpful. The next question is from Baroness Neville-Jones.
Thank you very much for your very helpful answers. I'd like to take, since what you've already said, and just ask you to broaden out your thinking a little bit. What would you say were the main characteristics of a of a culture of innovation in forensic science? What would you like to see, its main characteristics, which both incorporates the technological advance as well as doing basic forensic science research, and also, if you might say so, what do you reckon that the role of government should be in creating that kind of or attitude to and culture of forensic science?
Yeah, it's a very, very complex question. I guess, okay, I think I already touched base on some of the fundamentals, some kind of epistemological research that is needed in forensic science research and innovation. Really, it's very difficult if we only do research on the technical element. So the technical element is very important, but we need to go beyond the technical element. We need to understand how the technical element is linked to the provision of intelligence, to the provision or helping investigation, to the provision of evidence in court. How is it linked to being more efficient? What's the ethics around there? So there are a lot of questions across the board, and again, there is a need for a transdisciplinary approach, to forensic science research. Otherwise, we only tackle a very small part, and usually the easy part, and mostly, the aspect of evidence in court. One observation I can make. When you look at the kind of what's published, the efforts, what people are concerned about, quite often it's about the court space. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that should be forgotten, and that's not important. But what I'm trying to say is the vast majority of cases and aspects where forensic science can have an immediate impact on society and security is really the policing and security space. Again, there is strong need to really see it at the vision of forensic science. There's not one player helping, security or intelligence, helping investigation or policing, or helping courts and having it right in court. It's all of that. And again, it's almost impossible to have a helicopter view of all of that if we don't have enough people, enough academic units which see forensic science as the discipline and not simply as the application of someone else's discipline.
Chairman, can I just supplement? Professor, that's very interesting. Do you see a particular role that public policy should play in creating a culture of that kind?
Yes, I think it's a question of really coordination. It's really a question where public policy should really invest in creating an appropriate body that can, pretty much embody the cooperation and collaboration that is needed between apparently very disparate fields. And again, if I don't want to be patronizing, but if I look at what happened in Australia in the 80s with very famous miscarriage of justice cases, and I guess the outcomes of that, the main one was the creation of the National Institute of Forensic Science. And the National Institute of Forensic Science has played a major role in really busting the silos between different geographical entities, between different culturally diverse fields, between different disciplines. They've played a major role in improving and providing a quality environment when we talk about accreditation, certification, and also providing a proper framework to help to assist and form these strong partnerships that are needed between different providers and academia and regulatory agencies.
And is that...
So I guess, again, I'm sorry.
Well, I'd just like to know, is that publicly funded? That
The National Institute.
National Institute, is it?
Yes, that's public. Yes, yeah. I mean, one thing to understand is Australia is a federal country, which sometimes it's a good thing, but sometimes creates some additional difficulties. But definitely, NIFS has been publicly funded. For many years, it's been publicly funded by police agencies. Now, my understanding is that it's funded not only by police agencies, but also by all forensic science providers in government. So all different forensic laboratories, whether they are police or not, and so on, they contribute to NIFS funding. But I'm aware that you've got the forensic science regulator, and I guess my personal view is that at the very least, very least, the role of the regulator should be significantly increased and made broader. I think there are interesting lessons that can be learned by, what happened with NIFS in Australia, and I'm sure that I'm more than happy, and if you don't know the people, to assist, to make contacts with the appropriate people within these organizations.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you, Claude. I'm now going to move on to the next question, and Lord Hunt will take that question.
Thank you. This is a question we've heard in written and oral evidence about the value of a sterile corridor between investigators and the delivery of forensic science. And to what degree is this achieved in other jurisdictions? And in your view, what challenges having a separation of this nature create and address? Can I just add my own comment that one of the questions that we have heard about is the trend in the last 10 years in the UK to have a better overview by the judge or the person, the chairman of the court, to see that the science being introduced both by the prosecution and defence is properly compared rather than just used in an adversarial way. And I'd be very interested to know your comments about this role of the judge person in that.
Yes. Look, sterile corridor. Look, I'm not sure if I will answer the question directly there, but I guess in an ideal world, it's clear, forensic science would be independent of policing and mainly for public perception reasons. And in some concerns around, independence, bias, and so on. But the reality is different. I mean, the forensic scientist deals with police on a daily basis through investigation, or they work in a police organization. So it's difficult to see a full absolute independence. And my view is that it's more about impartiality rather than independence that is crucial. And impartiality can be built into the organizational culture through education and management. I mean, I mentioned before the trying to make forensic science more effective and having more impact, especially at the early stages, and the increased value of the intelligence value of forensic science. And again, it requires to dismantle silos and have appropriate data sharing. So there is a bit of a tension with the idea of a sterile corridor here. I guess I'm not sure, it's probably not directly your question, but if we talk about whether forensic science should be within police or completely separate, I guess the advantage within police is the ability to have forensic science where it can impact the most effectively in a timely fashion, as I mentioned, but also probably more likely to have an adequate funding stream, although it's not always the case. Now, if you look at again, the AFP is a good example. Another example is the French gendarmerie, who have recently established a facility that comprises 3 integrated pillars: crime intelligence, crimes in digital environment, and forensic science laboratory. So again, you've got this idea of a problem-orientated approach where the problem is treated transversely and combining different knowledge from multiple domains. So I guess I'm a bit, I have some reservation to have a very strong sterile corridor in a way that, there is a risk of introducing silos and, miscommunications. And it's really a question of probably having in place structures that favor the integration, remove the silos, but in the same time can manage the negative aspects of that and manage the risk appropriately. I haven't really commented on the core aspect of that. I'm not sure if I'm really in a position to answer that.
Yeah. Can I? Did you understand my question about the role of the judge? Because I've seen science being brought by different interests, and the question then is, finally, the judge has got to explain to the jury how these different areas of science relate to this case, and is this and that's relatively new, as explained to us by judges.
Yes.
I wonder whether you would like to comment on that.
Yeah, okay. On that particular aspect, I mean, I think that's really the job of the forensic scientist. In a way that the expression of the value of the evidence that is presented, it's really what the forensic scientist should be doing. Primarily.
Okay.
Now, I understand that forensic scientists may come and go for very specific aspects of the case, and it's very rare for one forensic scientist to have a helicopter view on the whole case, and hence I can understand that in that case it's where the judge can make these comments, but in cases like that, I think probably a good way to deal with that would be to have, again, a general forensic scientist who can be the sort of a maestro of an orchestra, like in an orchestra where you have different players playing different instruments, and nevertheless you have a maestro who understands how the whole thing fits together. And so I think there would be a need rather to have a forensic scientist in a similar role like that.
Claude, Baroness Young has a supplementary question to that.
In the good systems that you have experienced, how do they ensure that the defence gets access to good forensic science?
Yeah, so look, okay, first in Switzerland, it's a completely different system, as you know. It's an inquisitorial system. The the forensic scientist appears and as experts, for the court, appointed by the court. So it's completely different. Look, I don't think on that aspect, I don't think it's fundamentally different, in Australia from what you experience in, in England and Wales. I think a strong point would be for government laboratories to have the ability to provide forensic expertise to the defense, equally, to the prosecution, and that happens on a regular basis in Australia, where you have usually another jurisdiction, will be involved to maybe provide some expertise, and in a case where another jurisdiction, the government provider provide the advice to the prosecution.
Thank you, Claude. Lord Oxborough has a short supplementary.
Yeah, I'm slightly surprised that in all of the evidence that we've had on this, I've not heard any mention of CSIRO. Is that just chance, or does CSIRO have no role here?
Look, CSIRO have, it's interesting. CSIRO have, have contributed on a very, very focused technical aspects of some forensic science research here and there, or some specific fields, like, for example, when there is a very strong forensic soil expertise within a CSIRO department. These people would provide some forensic service, if you want. But across the board, simply said, they are not a major player in forensic science research or education or even provision in Australia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Claude. I'm going to move on now, and the next question is from Baroness Young, and this is a very important question she's about to ask you, and you mentioned earlier on, and please feel free to go in as much detail as you like.
Thank you very much, Professor Roux. I'm really enjoying your evidence. It's very useful to us. One of the areas that we're struggling with in the UK is digital forensics, where we're just being swamped by the volume of digital information that potentially is available and often isn't extracted quickly, comprehensively and analysed in an effective way, and primarily appears to lie primarily with police services. Tell us about your experience in good services and what we should learn from them.
Yes, look, if I can say, you are probably not the only ones struggling. This is obviously a major challenge. It's a major challenge for a number of reasons. So, we see a digital transformation of society.
Doing so well.
Can somebody press the right button, please?
Yeah, we need to go back to it.
I'm going to suspend this session while we try to reconnect.
Sorry?
Hold on, see if we can reconnect.
The proceeding is currently suspended.